Good evening, everybody. My name is Whee Teck. I'm the admin for the Singapore Sketchers group on Facebook. Very glad to have you guys here. We have, I don't know, maybe about 20, no, less than that, 18, thereabout. This one today, just caveat it. I don't intend to cover basic stuff, but I want to just take maybe for those that are, I would say, advanced beginners to benefit from thinking about shadows, sketching shadows, and also designing shadows into their sketches. I will try to cram as much information as I can in 1 hour. 60 minutes is actually not a lot. I have a playlist that Belle can share on the chat later on, or even now on my YouTube channel. And I talk a little bit about shadows and things like that and how it applies on the sketches. But let's just start by looking at a couple of my sketches, and I'll just explain why I think shadows is so important, right? So, let me put this away. And this is the first sketch that you see that I've done last year, and it was part of my YouTube channel, and I talk about how you can simply sketch something. This is one of the simplest sketch that you can do. Cherry. Right? I mean, but as you can see, this sketch is very flat. There's no shadow. There's nothing to indicate form, and therefore the whole sketch is just very, very flat. Whereas if you compare it to something like this, where you would see that in each of the sushi, if you like, and this is something that I was doing with Susan, right? Susan's one of the sketch together session, where you could see that there is all the shadowy bit, right? If I lift it up, you see that there are shadows indicating their highlights, and then there are shadows on both sides, and there are shadow in between the sushis. And all these shadows indicate the three-dimensional form of the sketch itself, right? So to me, the ability to look at something and then indicate shadow creates a three-dimensional structure for your sketch, right? So that's my first point. Basically, the first thing that I want to say, you can create a sketch with a shape, right? So this is a shape. But in order for you to create a three-dimensional form, so this is 2D, much like this sketch here, right? In order for it to make into a three-dimensional form, you have to add shadows. That really is the reason why shadows is important. So I'll give you an example here, where if I were to create the form, and I put the shadow down on this side, right? Assuming that you can read the shadow, right? Okay. Too much water. All right. So as you can see, the shadow will create the form in the sense of two-dimensional becoming three-dimensional. So that's the very first thing that I want to talk about. In most cases that you are sketching, you want to watch out for where you put your shadow, because your shadow will define that three-dimensional form, like I said. Okay, let me just grab some tissue and blot out. Okay, so incidentally, most people think that watercolors are not rescuable once it's done. It's true to some extent, but a lot of time you can actually edit your watercolor. You can actually rescue it somewhat by either going through it again or by washing away some of the edges and so on. But of course, you can also mess it up still, right? Anyway, so let me come back. So that's the first point I want to, all right. The second point I want to make, shadow, is this idea that colors itself is one of the most important things. Sorry, there's some background noise. Can I mute? Sorry, I'm just muting whoever it is. Colors is one of the key things that can help you, create much better shadows. So I'm going to use this video. I'm going to play this video. Just hang on, let me set it up. Okay, shadows. Let me know when you can see the screen.
See colors in shadow.
Yep.
Okay, let's talk about this photograph as an example. And we zoom in to this part of the strawberry. Zooming in a little bit more, you see the red on the top left versus the shadow red on the bottom right. You don't understand what I'm saying? Well, let me try again. Well, let's take this and let's just make it into two tones. You see the light and the shadow version of the strawberry? Do you see it? Do you see it? So do you see it? Do you see it?
Apologies for the over-dramatized of the video.
Light in the form of the colors you paint, it changed the way I look at the world and it changed the way I sketch as an urban sketcher. And I want to change the way you look at the world and the way you sketch and paint as well, so that you can improve as a sketcher. I've gone through a lot of pain in learning about color theory and all the rest of it, but if I were to make you understand this one thing about color, it will change the way you sketch and see the world. So let's do this one more time with this lemon. Alright, so you look at this photograph where the, zoom in, the yellow that is bright and the yellow in the shadow. So now in your sketch, you can approximate the light and the shadow thus. Of course, the edges between the two shapes needs to be softened up, just like in reality what you see, but you get the idea. You must first be able to see the color as it is in the light and in the shadow. Well, don't trust me. Let's look at what the masters, Seurat in this case, famous painting. Let's see what he does with exactly the same, understanding. The color he used for the top of the two ladies, exactly the same. One in the light, one in the shadow. Or between the two patch of grass, one in the light, one in the shadow. You get the idea? That is why this concept of painting light is the most important thing about color.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to explain what I've just said. Color defines shadows. So if you take a color, and I'm going to demonstrate it here with, using my palette. And if you look at, for example, this yellow, right? And if you put some of the yellow here, pure yellow, and you want to put, let's say, a yellow shadow, right? You could, for example, add a bit of brown to it, or probably a little bit of the opposite color, which is, in this case, is a bit of a purple. So by doing that, you are actually creating the sensation that this is in the light and this is in the shadow. One of the key things about sketching something is that you want to be able to depict what is light, what is shadow. By the way, if you have any question, please feel free to throw it into the chat. Belle will be observing the chat for me, and then we'll.
I believe only should go to the side.
Sorry, Belle, you take the question for me if there's chat, yeah?
Yeah, I'll take the question. But someone just said something.
Sorry, I just muted somebody. Apology. Was there a question, somebody? No, I'm going to keep going. All right, so if you think about the color of your palette, yellow, if you add a bit of the opposite, which is purple, will get you a yellow that is in the shadow. The trick here when you're sketching shadow is that you do not want to make your shadow yellow into purple, right? That is not a shadow yellow. You still want a yellow that looks like a yellow, but muted enough with the complementary, in this case purple, that it looks like it's in the shade. this takes a bit of a practice to get, right? So give you an example. If you put a bit of red and you want a shadowy red, for example, what do? Well, you add the red with a bit of green, right? And in this case, I'm going to throw in a bit of green, right? And I'm going to mix them on paper. And this green added to the red is going to give me the red that I still want, but it's in the shadow, right? Not enough. Takes a bit of practice to get this, right? So you can see that it's a muted red, right? This is a muted red, and this is a pure red. This is a muted or shadowed red. You can do this with all the other colors in your palette by adding the complement. Okay, and in the color wheel is basically the opposite. So very quickly, with yellow you add purple, a combination of blue and red. With orange you add blue, with red you add green, and so on and so forth, if you know your color wheel, right? So I'm going to pause here. Is there any questions? Simple concept, but remember, when you mix it with your complement, don't make it until it becomes green, right? Don't make it until it becomes purple, but you want a muted version, right? The shadow is a muted version of the lighted version. Okay.
I think, is there an easy way to remember what's your complementary color or the color wheel?
There's only three primary colors. There's only three primary colors, right? The first one is yellow, right? If I look at my, it's yellow, red, and blue. Those are the primary colors. So the secondary colors are those that are mixed between those three. So yellow and red gives you orange, and red and blue gives you purple, and yellow and blue gives you green. So those three colors that's just being mixed are secondary colors, right? And if you think about it, opposite of the primary colors are the directly opposite the, okay, maybe I do a quick one, right? So yellow, red, and blue, when you mix them, this gives you orange, red and blue gives you purple, blue and gives you green. So that's basically the 6 colors, right? You can pretty much mix them on your own. I won't do it now because of time, but when you talk about the opposite, it is the diagonal, the direct opposites of those colors. That's the complement, right? Belle, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, color is complicated, but
I have a question.
yeah, sure, Susan, shoot.
What's my question? I lost my train of thought. Oh, if I mix blue and orange,
Yeah.
Versus red and green, which of this gives me the most neutral gray?
They all gives you gray, but they are different gray. They such thing as a neutral gray. In the color theory world, assuming that in the middle is the true gray, when you are perfectly balancing your opposites, right? In other words, when you're able to balance your perfectly the opposite, in other words, you have perfectly balanced the yellow and the purple, the green and the red, orange and the blue. So this is the gray zone, right? Gray zone. So the most beautiful grays are mixed. Okay, when you can get a tube of gray like such Payne's gray, they are ugly as hell, right? So you know, there's nothing beautiful about like, you know, straight from a tube type of gray. It's not very exciting actually. So I wouldn't recommend that beginners use this. Rather learn to mix your own gray, right? The most beautiful grays are actually mixed. Make sense?
That makes sense. I find that blue and orange is tough because it's always olive gray, it's always yellowish, and sometimes it's muddy.
Yeah.
So maybe it's my orange, or maybe it's
a shortcut to think about this, right? Green and red, right? Green and red are the Christmas color. You agree?
Yeah, that's easiest to remember, right?
That's the easiest to remember, right? So red and green are Christmas color, right?
Mhm.
Blue and orange are the traditional watercolorist color. The blue that traditional watercolorists use is ultramarine or French ultramarine,
Mhm.
traditional color that you will find Singapore Watercolor Society members will use. It's always in their palette. The opposite is burnt sienna,
Mhm.
right? That's the dirty orange that they always use. So these two create a beautiful gray. And
Mhm.
the traditional watercolorists will have these two colors in their palette for sure. Either ultramarine or French ultramarine, burnt sienna, right? And
Yeah.
those two, if you mix it, you will find it in almost all of the traditional watercolors in the world. You can't run away, that blue and orange. And
But when you depend on how much you add in terms of burnt sienna and the blue, right, you can get a warmer gray or a slightly cooler gray, actually.
that's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And I don't want to go into warm and cool. That's probably for another session. But that's a big one, by the way. That's a very, very big topic. But the idea is that a mixed gray like so is so much more beautiful than these, right? Which are straight out of the tube, right? And you want to be in control of your gray. In other words, you want to have colors separating by itself and producing, tones like this, where they are giving you a sense of shimmering, right? There's a slight shimmering in the colors, right? There's no shimmering in these colors. So
So do you recommend to mix it right on the paper? Or do you recommend it mixing it in the palette first to get that shimmering thing?
Both. You can have it both. Both works. Traditional teachers will tell you don't mix it on a paper, mix it on a palette and then throw it on. I'll say both techniques, depending on what you're trying to do, it works for you, right? So if you want the color to be separated even more, mix it on a paper. But if you want the color to be separate less, mix it. But it depends on what you're trying to create and what you're trying to do. Yeah, I mean, there's no right or wrong, as you know, in art, and I certainly never tell you there's a rule, right? The thing is what you're trying to do. A mistake could be a technique for the next project, right? So just learn to appreciate what the material do for your art, basically. Okay. Any
The question that asks, can burnt umber to mute? Can use burnt umber to mute the colors for shadow colors?
The answer is yes. Burnt umber is a darker version of brown. So burnt sienna is a lighter version. Burnt umber is a darker version. In fact, I do have burnt umber in my palette. This one is a burnt umber. I traditionally use burnt quinacridone burnt orange, which is my go-to for brown. Lighter than burnt umber, but I was too lazy to go to Straits to buy because I ran out. Finally, all my burnt umber is gone. Burnt orange is gone. So I look around and I found a tube closest to what I want, which was burnt umber. So that's this case. It works. It depends on what you want. There's no right or wrong answer. Burnt umber is perfectly legit on your palette, like mine in this case. For now, when I finish, I'll probably go back to queen burnt orange because I really like that color. Okay, so I have described those two concepts, three-dimensional, right? Two-dimensional, three dimensions created by shadows. Colors, you have to look at colors from a light and a shadow part, and you can mix this by adding the complement, right? Any colors by adding complement, you will get a shadow part. The trick is don't mix it until it becomes a complement color, right? In other words, don't mix until you get this, but learn to get the yellow. It still look yellow, but it has a depth of the complement thrown in. It still look red and not green, and that's what you want. So in this sense, you will be able to create what Seurat did with his painting, right? It's all not based on value, but based on color. The color is what gives the idea of shadows into the painting. And that's actually, it takes practice, but you can get there. Not really a problem per se, okay? Okay, next, number 3 that I want to talk about. Again, I will show you this video, and bear with me as I change to a different video. This is one of my favorite video, but it is not to say it's complicated or whatever, but it's something that not so easy to understand. Okay, I'm just going to show it. Give me a second. Inside shoe share. Okay, here we go.
Inktober shoe. Painting light and shade. And not a shoe. Hello again. As usual, I'm gonna start my sketch with a very simple line. If you can see the reference photograph, you can
Yeah, I'm gonna
see
skip
that
through this part,
the
right?
lady's holding a cup of coffee, probably Starbucks, the toe and feet. So that's the focus.
Drawing not so important for today.
The shadow shape. That includes the
So as
shadow
you can
part
see,
of
right,
the feet.
I'm painting
That includes
the
the
shadow
dress, and
in
that
one
includes,
shape. In other words,
coffee
I'm painting
cup
shadow and the
hand.
object
So,
itself in one
I use a
shape
mixture
rather than
of
multiple shapes.
cobalt, permanent, it's queen rose and queen burnt orange. Those three mixed together, I create this sort of gorgeous mix of purple. And in one shape, well, some where they are more cobalt or more queen rose, but anyway, in one shape, I put it down, and I soften the edge where the dress is, and I do a bit of splatter just for effects. There's no reason apart from having fun. And as you can see, I'm gonna go in with a queen rose for the shoe, where I am going to make where the part of the sun is pure queen rose, and where the part is and I drop in a bit of a cat orange to it to make it pop. I only drop the cat orange where the sun hits the shoe, and that should really make the color sort of pop. And then I use my favorite skin tone colors, maple yellow with a bit of queen rose mixed, both where the sun hits the feet, as well as the part where the shades is. And you can see the skin tone sort of form, and it sort of beautifully create the idea of shadow and so on. Oops, I kind of spilled a bit of colors on it. Never mind, it's just a sketch, right? Don't get too frustrated with frustrated with mistakes like that. But anyway, I go in with a bit more of a deeper color, and that deeper color essentially is cobalt and queen rose, a bit darker version, a dash of permanent alizarin crimson in it as well. No harm adding that colors, right? Dip a bit more, or splatter a bit more, because since I've already made the mistakes, might as well. I think I'm kind of done, and that's it. Write my name and the date. But hang on, not very happy with it because I think the shadow is not popping. So this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna take a darker version of purple. In this case, it is French ultramarine with permanent alizarin crimson, along with a dash of queen burnt orange. Those three colors, and this will really give it a very, very dark shadow shape. And I'm just gonna give it a second layer, and this time the shadow should really, really pop like that. Well, while you're at it, make sure that you also dash a bit, soften the edges, make it easy on the eye. Another dab, soften the other two parts of the edges, and maybe some small lines here and there, the toes, the nails, maybe some parts where I think there's a bit of a shadow. And I think we are done. Oh well, a bit more shadow part on the feet where the shades, to make sure that we can read it, our eyes can read the shade. That's it. I hope you like that. Subscribe and like the video. Thank you.
All right, so I hope you got something out of that. Maybe you have questions, right? But you saw that the way I painted that sketch was basically, getting the shadow in first. That will neutralize the parts where the shadows will go, basically. I mean, once you have laid down and then you put bright colors, the bright colors on top of muted colors, and because watercolors are transparent, you will unmute or unbright the color will just tone down and with a bit of shade. So in that sense, Susan, one of the things that you can do is also not just necessarily mix the color, but wait for the first layer to dry and then you layer up, right? But the shadow has gone in. So the second layer that goes in where the shadows are, it will become, added with a complement, if you like. So those are the ideas you can play with. it comes back to the idea of basically layering the complement ultimately. You can layer gray, not so nice, but you can always layer, all the opposites, right? So that is much more interesting, if you like. That's just the way I think about, like, shadows, generally speaking. Okay. Okay. Now,
Thank you.
yeah. I want to talk about something that most people don't really, consider. But let me just pull out this painting by Seurat. Okay, he did this very interesting painting that most of us will be very familiar with, and it is one of his famous painting. Right, it's called the Island of this one. Right, let me share it. Okay, I'm sure you all know this painting, right? Yeah, familiar with this? Right. So if you look at the way the light and shadow is depicted, the light and the shadow, I have a video that actually described that, right? As you saw earlier, you can go and look at the video later on. But in this case, you will see that although you can depict shadows with values, in other words, you can make everything sort of black and white and toned down and it's a bit darker. True, shadows are generally darker, but it's more impressive when you can actually use color to depict shadow. In other words, if you use the technique I have described here, right, and each of the color that exists in this, you will find that basically the color pops much better. It is much more interesting when you see this, like this, right? So the color spells shadow. One more thing I want to say is that most beginners will look at shadow as a single piece. In other words, they'll look at shadow as maybe underneath the dog or the cat or the person. But the way Seurat look at it is like the shadow is a one big piece. It covers pretty much the lower half of the painting. And then it covers the bulk of the figures, the two figures on the right, as well as the seated figures with the umbrella. That whole piece is what is called the shade. And when you are sketching out, either urban sketching or whatever it is, I want you to think about how do you actually design your sketch with big, broad shade of light and big, broad shade of shadow. And in this case, it's almost in, well, they're not exactly half, but they are almost in equal measure, if you like. The light is a big chunk, and then the dark is a big chunk, and they are basically one piece each, more or less, right? So I'm going to stop sharing. Does that make sense? And this is one of the most important designs. So, I talk about see, simplify, and sketch. The ability to see shadows, how shadow react, under harsh light, and how it react under cloudy condition, diffused sort of shadow, right? And that's important. For example, if you look at, something like this under harsh light, right? Well, there are multiple light sources. Let me switch off this. So if you look at this one light, right, you can see that the light is harsher. The shadow is harsher when I'm putting the tissue pack closer, but when I lift it up, it becomes diffused, right? So the point is, as a sketcher, you must be conscious of what you see. Your ability to see the edges of the shadow is the beginning of how you can sketch them, right? So I hope that makes sense. Does it make sense? Right? So you must be able to see, right? The first one. See that. You must be able to see your shadows. Number two, you must be able to simplify them, like Seurat, right? The way he simplified it was not to think of shadow as tiny little pieces of shadow everywhere underneath the, the windowsill or whatever. He thinks of big, broad shadows, like the one I just did a sketch as well of the lady with the coffee. It's one whole piece of shadow right from the feet all the way up to the skirt and all the way to the hand that holds the coffee. It's one piece. And you got to think of it as light and shade. right? Light and shade, not tiny little bit of shadows. If you paint little bit of shadows here and there, they very soon becomes muddy and it becomes an ugly piece of work actually. So you want to think of the whole piece, design it, simplify it, and finally learn to sketch it. And sketching is a technique. It's about be able to mix the color, right? That's technique. That's about ability to sketch. So what I'm trying to say is the whole thing about shadow is first learn to see, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is you want to simplify. Well, Leonardo da Vinci says the simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, right? That's a tough one. But you know, if you are able to simplify, you've gone a long way. The third is the ability to sketch, right? And when I say sketch, I mean the ability to execute colors like this, understanding the color wheel, be able to mix shadows and so on, right? So, but it starts with this. It starts with seeing. Because if you don't see, you will not be able to simplify and sketch. It doesn't make sense. So, you know, beginners are always very excited about, like, can you tell me what are the colors you use? What are the, you know, brushes, the, you know, what paper and so on, right? But they forgot to ask the question of, what about, how do you see, right? How do you simplify? How do you design your sketch? Because ultimately these two get you a long way compared to this, right? Now I'm going to pause here because I've just thrown you quite a lot of theory and quite a lot of stuff, right? And I'm sure a lot of people would have a lot of questions in your head. So maybe I'll take a few more questions. Belle, any question on the chat?
No question on the chat.
Okay, maybe people might want to unmute and ask me a question.
I have a question.
Yeah, shoot.
I was trying to understand the optic primary colors versus the one that create white, and then the one that actually create black. I was trying to read this in different places and I still don't understand it.
Right. Sorry. Repeat the question.
So there's two kinds of primaries. One that is actually, if you mix all of it, it becomes black.
Yeah.
And then there's the CMY.
Yeah.
Which then, if you mix everything, it becomes white.
Oh yeah. I physics. Okay. In the world of physics, if you put colors, in other words, if you were to shine a red onto a wall, a yellow, and blue, or in this case, actually, I think it's green.
Cyan, I think they call it.
You will actually get white, because white is a composition of all those colors combined. In the world of physics, where you're using light to paint the wall, you are adding colors like so, right? But when you actually use colors like this in my palette to mix colors, it's actually the opposite. You're not adding, you're actually taking, you're subtracting, right? I'm not explaining this very well, but basically when you put two colors together, you are taking away the ability to see certain light rather than adding light into the spot. When you are actually using light to shine on a wall, you are adding lights together. When you're painting with different ingredients or different pigments, you are subtracting or
subtracting light. Right? I see.
So because of that, when you add two colors, you actually see less actually. So ultimately, when you add more and more colors, it becomes a bunch of gray. Right? But whereas in physics, when you shine lights, you are adding components of light into the ultimate display, right? Wall in this case, or the LED, or whatever it may be, and you are actually emitting more colors, and it becomes white because all the colors are inside, so it becomes white.
Yeah. So that doesn't really apply to watercolor.
No, watercolor is subtractive. It's not additive.
It's not additive, right?
No. It's only when you're doing installation art, then you have to be careful with the color addition when you're doing lights as a source. So, you know, like recently there was a tiger being painted on the mountains of Switzerland, right? If you have not, go look it up. It was the largest art display installation ever, I think, because it was on the Swiss Alps. And the artist that uses it was using projection of light, weather condition, sunlight, and all the rest of it, and projected a tiger onto the mountain, right? To celebrate the friendship between China and Switzerland. I think something like that. It was a tiger lunar year, right? So that was additional. They have to figure out how to add the lights under it. But when you're doing watercolor like so, you are actually subtracting. But anyway, the only thing that you need to worry about is this color theory I've described, right? So you don't have to worry about what you just asked, basically, unless you do installation art. That'll be a different thing, right?
Got it. Thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Back to the color wheel. What if your color itself, the color of the object is not the primary color? It's like skin color. So what do you add to what's the complementary of the skin color?
Yeah. So when you look at skin color, we can, that's a very good question. So let me maybe illustrate it with my favorite skin tone. So if I were to draw with my favorite skin tone, which is Naples yellow, usually, and I would normally throw in a little bit of queen rose into it to make my favorite skin tone color, right? And usually I would have put in, let's say, for shadow, I would have put in a little bit of blue first, okay? And then I will throw in the skin tone. And when this dry, you will see that the skin tone, for example, this would be lighted version, and this is the shadowy part of it. Well, does that answer your question?
No, does it mean you always throw purple?
No.
Regardless of the color of the object.
Specifically for skin tone, the formula or the recipe I have, and you can copy this if you like, is the shadow part. I would add either a cobalt blue or a French ultramarine at the base. This is the base. And wet on wet, I will add a mixture of, this is Naples yellow, with usually medium, right? I will use the medium version, plus a bit of quinacridone rose. These two mixture for a light color skin tone. That means this skin tone, this is usually Asian, Japanese, Chinese, right? If you want to have a bit more darker, you might add a bit of burnt umber or burnt sienna into it to have maybe a Malay skin tone or burnt umber for an Indian skin tone. That could be possible. It depends on what you're seeing as well. I'm not, it's what you see, right? Ultimately, but the base of the shadow is this, and then the mixture of skin tone is this. The queen rose can be added to be more darker if you like. Burnt sienna is something that you can use, and if you need darker, you can go to burnt umber.
So is there a reason why you're using Naples yellow? Because that's opaque, right?
It's opaque. The reason why I'm using Naples yellow is because it's opaque. It's partially opaque, and skin tone is partially opaque.
Okay.
It will not work. Skin tone won't work really well with transparent watercolor. It won't work very well. It needs a bit of opacity to it. So you can mix opaque yellow. How do you do it? You take burnt sienna, you add a bit of zinc or maybe titanium white, and that mixture will give you somewhat of a Naples yellow combination.
I think zinc is more transparent, right?
But basically, you need a bit of opaque in it, right? Yeah, there's a bit of meat in it. There's a bit. It's like when you sketch, for example, durian. Okay, if you use a full transparent colors, like if I have my transparent color like lemon yellow and all my other transparent colors, right? And I don't use any of the Naples or cadmium, for example, my durian will look very transparent. There's no meat to it. Try it, right? Throw a bit of opaque, and then it becomes, but your opaque cannot be overused. Opaque has to be mixed with transparent, and it has to be wet in wet, including skin tone is the same. It has to be wet in wet. If you apply opaque colors like Naples into your skin washes, they will look like a bunch of sticker on a person, right? It's like slap or like thick makeup that doesn't work. if you know what I'm trying to say. Okay, so those are the consideration for skin tone. It's a very special form of shadow actually, Belle. This one is a whole class by itself, right?
But if I refer back to your color wheel, doesn't mean that if I look at the color wheel, doesn't mean that your maple yellow is something like yellow, your queen rose is like rose. So when I add them, it become orange, and the opposite complementary is blue. Is that how I see?
Well, in this case, it's still pretty much an orange, right? So one way is you can mix a bit of French ultramarine to it to make like the shadow part of it, right? So you can maybe add a bit of that. So if you look at the shadow part, you can see this very commonly used by traditional watercolorists. They add French ultramarine or blue to the shadow side of the skin tone. Very, very common. This is what they do, right? It comes from this theory, actually. But I'm saying it doesn't have to be. You can add also purple, if you like, for that same effect, right? Assuming you have a more yellow type of skin tone, you can add purple to it too. Nothing wrong with this. Okay, both will work depending on your color scheme. So then you have to decide in your sketch which is the one that will work better in your overall color scheme, right? There's no right and wrong, basically, right? In that sense, it's a thinking about your sketch and designing it. So remember, as I say, you're going to try to simplify. You're going to try to sketch it. In the sketching, the recipe could be a lot. I mean, usually beginners will have one recipe, not a lot, but the idea is that you collect multiple recipe and use it in different situations. And then, in some cases where you might just use the neutrals, because that works. Sometimes because of your color scheme, you want a bluish gray. Sometimes you want a purplish gray. Sometimes you want a reddish gray, and so on and so forth, right? All those will work actually, but I would say you think about your color scheme in your sketch, which gives you the reason why you're using a particular, a particular color for complement. So if for example, this sketch has a lot of orange, right? So obviously I want my gray to be a bit on the bluer side to create the opposite effect, right? That's what I will do. If I use a sketch that has some color, I just want to look at the opposite as well. Right, Belle? Make sense?
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong in that sense. Right. So for example, I give this one. So this is another sketch, right? So a lot of yellow and so a purple yellow combination. This shadow, of course, is fake. But if you look at it, the shadow is one piece. You can't find the line between the apple and the shadow, right? That's intentional. That's just lost, right? And actually, that's my next point about edges and shadow. I'm going to use another famous drawing to discuss. But if you can look at this, there's no line, it's one, and I have designed the whole thing as light and shadow, right? That's how I designed the sketch. And that's about simplifying. Of course, when you look at a particular scene, it's not quite straightforward like that. It's not so simple, right? But looking in light and shadow is a fundamental skill that sketchers needs to pick up. Well, artists generally, but sketchers, right? That's about simplifying it. And the ability to execute a sketch like this is about understanding the color wheel and understanding your palette to be able to mix them, with lots of practice, of course, but eventually you get to a certain level of execution and it gets better, right? In that sense. Yeah, I hope that helps because I've covered a lot of ground. You can get a degree on this basically. In fact, you can get a PhD. So Wunlam's study is on color theory, right? He wrote a book about it. I have the book. I read it a couple of times. Quite complicated, I must say, but but it's worth studying in terms of color theory. But back to shadows, right? What have I covered, right? 2D, 3D shadows. Color is a primary reason for creating shadow. Be able to mix them, right? Using complement. You must learn to see, learn to simplify, learn to sketch with different recipe. And you should then, of course, there's a question on skin tone. That is a specific usage of the generic, understanding here. Okay.
I think it's a question. When sketching a hill or mountain with a pen, how do we figure out where to put the shades and paint it with watercolor?
For mountain?
Mountain or hills? Yeah. How do we figure out where to put the shades and paint it with watercolor?
I think for mountain, I don't think it's so much as shadow or not so much about the light and shadow, but more about distance. When you're painting mountains and distance, you're creating space. You know, on a two-dimensional piece of paper like such, right? Like such, you can't really create a sense of distance. Distance is very, very hard. It's one of the elements of drawing, or space, right? Space is one of the elements of art, right? Or design. You want to create the ability to show that this mountain is nearer than this mountain, right? How do I do it? I use size, shape, right, to indicate distance. So when you look at a painting and you're trying to create lots of scenery of mountain, you're trying to create this sense of distance. You're painting distance, actually. That's the reason why it's important to think in terms of foreground, which means there's something in the foreground, right? So there's something in the foreground, a tree maybe, right? And then there's something in the mid-ground, which are the mountains. And maybe there are something in the further away. Maybe there are even some more mountain, they are smaller, and so on. This is the background. So this is mid, this is foreground, this is background. So I don't think it's about shadow. It's more about creating space using your ability to use color and so on. Now, how do you create space? One is size, shape, but another way is using color, right? The color in front are more intense. The color in the midground are less intense. The color in the background are even less intense or diffused, right? So you can think of it like I can use a little bit of, let's say, tiny bit of color, much more intense in the midground, and way more intense, even opaque, or some kind of a really bright color to create a foreground. I'm making this up, clearly. These are abstract, right? But I hope you get the point. It's not about shadow. It's more about space and distance. If you're painting the sort of landscape, in that sense. I hope that answered the question. Whoever came up with it, are you happy with the answer? If not, can you maybe rephrase it? Okay, next question, maybe.
There's another question. We deplete shadows by adding primary color with its complementary color. How about secondary colors? Do they have a corresponding complementary colors?
Same.
Similar to what I've asked just now.
Yeah, it's the same. Let me look up a simple color wheel and then we can kind of talk through that, right? We have about 10 minutes, all right.
I actually have one here.
Yeah. Okay, I found one. I'm just gonna
Yeah, I think it's easy.
Yeah, let me just share that. Okay. Okay, let me share this screen and we can talk through the color wheel. Okay, can you see it? Can you see the color wheel on the screen?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, so primary colors are red, yellow, blue, right? Oh, this is not a color wheel. This is the wrong color wheel.
That's what I'm saying. That's confusing, right?
Yeah, it's very confusing when you are not. Let me use this one instead. Okay. Okay, can you see this one? Can you see this one?
Yeah.
The one that has a figure 1 color wheel, right? So primary. Secondaries are when you mix a primary. Tertiaries are when you mix primary with secondary. Does it make sense? Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So if you look at this color wheel, it has primary, secondary, and tertiary, right? So it becomes, I think for beginners, you'll be very confusing if you start thinking in tertiary, although they are important later on because you want variety and options. But by adding primary and primary, you get secondary. Primary, you get secondary. Primary, but by adding primary, secondary, you get tertiary. And the direct opposites are primary are secondary, right? The opposite of secondary are primary. Okay, they are not tertiary. Okay, so primary opposite is secondary, and primary is the opposite of primary is secondary, and the opposite of secondary is primary. Okay. So I'm going to leave that up, and I'm going to stop sharing. Does it answer the question, Belle?
So does it mean the opposite of tertiary is tertiary?
In this case, yes, because if you look at the wheel, you'll find that it actually shows that tertiary opposites are tertiary, right? Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's a bit confusing at this point because most people won't get to the tertiary in their painting because the most important color scheme is opposites. So in other words, you use a burnt sienna with cobalt or French ultramarine. You use lemon yellow with, let's say, some kind of a combination of quinacridone rose with cobalt, and so on and so forth, right? But you don't really want to get to the tertiary when you're learning because it becomes very complicated. Yeah, I don't recommend it, although it is worth studying and understanding it for yourself. In other words, play with your palette, right? Play with the palettes, understanding what is the primary, secondary, and so on from your palette, and then mix something out of it so that you can actually, understand what the color that you can get out of your palette, right?
So those color on your palette, are they considered primary?
Yeah.
Yeah, all primary.
Yeah. So I have a warm and cool of each colors, right? Forget about this. These are my most fundamental six. This 6 here, and they are lemon yellow, new gamboge, quinacridone rose, permanent alizarin crimson. This is cobalt blue. This is French ultramarine. Cool, warm, cool, warm. No, the other way. This is cooler. Actually, these two are on the cooler side, but this is more cool than this one. This is neutral, and this is cooler blue. Sorry, warmer blue. Yeah. Okay, it's complicated. Sorry, color theory is complicated. Pigment is even more complicated. I don't think you want to get into it here, but understand to say that I have 6 primary colors, and I try to have warm and cool of each so that I can mix better, basically. Actually, I have other reasons for it. Value, actually. If you want to know more, there's a video that I have on this, anyway, which I can send the link very quickly. Any other question at this point?
Whee Teck, what advice would you give to people who are new to watercolor or just started out? Because there's a tendency that when you add shadow, it gets very muddy because you were trying to achieve a very the contrast, basically. Yeah. Can you maybe share a bit of advice on that part? How to prevent that from happening?
When you start with actually, this was one of my very first YouTube video. Belle might remember this. When you start your watercolor journey, get rid of all your opaque. Okay, cadmiums out. These are cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, cadmium red out. Okay, keep only transparent color. There is no way you can mess up if you only have transparent color in your palette. You only mess up and make muddy color when you have opaque colors in your palette. Does that make sense? Okay, how do you know something is opaque or something is transparent? You take a bit of the color and you put it into a water bottle, right? You put it in it. If the results of putting the color into a bottle of water like this is like tea, it's transparent. If the result is like milk, that means you can't see through, it's opaque. Okay, so by just taking that color and just adding, let's say this is yellow, lemon yellow, right? And I put it in, you see that the color is pretty much like a tea. So this is a transparent color, right? If you start putting in, let's say, this is cadmium yellow, you see that it immediately turns like milk, basically. You can't see through anymore. The light can't get through. That's opaque. It has to do with the size of the molecule, basically. So the molecule is huge, so it blocks the light. Or the molecule is very small. But because it's the same hue, it will reflect the color, but one see-through, one's blocked. And tea and milk is the easiest analogy I can give you, basically. Yeah. And so if you ask me as a beginner, how do you learn watercolor and you don't want to create muddy painting, get rid of all your opaque. Belle, do you remember the video? That was my first video. Get rid of all the opaque. That's the easiest way to improve your watercolor. And how do you know?
Your YouTube video on that.
Yeah, how do you know? Well, if you buy the tube, they'll tell you that it's opaque. So just put it aside and put it away. Cadmium are all opaque. All cadmiums are opaque, basically. So put that away. Most of the Holbein colors are opaque as well. So, yeah. Okay, last one. I want to talk about one of my favorite painting of all time. Let me look it up. Okay, it's singer, Sargent, dancer. Yeah, it's a famous painting actually. Let me just flash it up, share. There we go. Let me know when you see it, Belle. Okay, why is this painting so incredible? Do you see the three guitar players, right? The three guitar players, they don't have legs, do they? But you see the legs in your mind. You don't see the legs in a painting. If you see the shadows behind the dancer is huge and diffused. If you see the shadow behind the guitarist, the flamenco dancer versus the guitarist, you see that it's sharp and much more defined, that shadow. And the definition of sharp versus diffuse edges gives a sense of space. In other words, the dancer is further away from the wall and the guitarist players are nearer to the wall, in fact, leaning on the wall almost. And the shadow underneath the guitarist player are disappearing, which shows that, well, he's probably lazy, he didn't want to paint it. I'm just kidding. But it was a way of depicting drama, right? It is such intensity of light and shadow. So you do have to remember that, let me stop sharing and I want to talk through this. You want to remember, in any sketch at all, any sketch that you do, you're not painting an object, you're painting light, right? Is that hard? That's hard, right? We're painting light. And when you are painting light, your arsenal is going to be all the elements of design. And what are the elements of design? Space, line, shape, form. Form is primarily created by shadows, right? Like I said, color, value, texture, 7 things. There are only 7 elements of design. And in all those, you're trying to create the reality of what you see. And it is, basically your ability to create a sketch, right? And you have to design it. But like I say, it starts with seeing, then it goes to ability to simplifying the concept in your head, and finally your ability to execute on a piece of paper, right? It's hard. This thing takes a lifelong journey to get anywhere near to mastery, but it's possible. I mean, with understanding and so on. So I'm going to pause here. I've given you all the theory I want to cover today, right? A quick recap, right? Again, 2 3D created by shadow, form, color, very, very important, the ability to mix them, complement, right? And ultimately, you want to go back to see simplify sketch as a way of looking at shadow and sketching it. That's it. That's all I want to cover for today. Any other question before we close for tonight? No?
The tea milk analogy, I think I heard it before under Mark Taro Holmes.
Yeah.
So is there a honey area?
No. Mark Taro was not talking about the same thing that I was talking about. He was talking about when you create a watercolor, the basic of watercolor is there is a tea consistency, there is a milk consistency, right? And there is a honey consistency, right? Tea, milk, honey consistency. He's talking about consistency on the watercolor, right? Basically, he's talking about tea, milk, and honey consistency. In other words, the flowing of the water. That's Mark Taro's milk. I've heard him spoke about this before. Yeah, quite different, Regina. It's different from what I was describing. I was talking about when you put the color into a bottle of water, right? If you get tea-like behavior, that's a transparent color. If you get a milk-like behavior, that's an opaque color. Slightly different.
I see.
Okay,
Thanks.
very good. I think that's it. We are just 1 minute over time. I guess 1-2 minutes. It's not a problem. Thank you for attending this. I hope it was useful. I try to pack as little as I can get away with. Those of you who knows me, I tend to overpack data into a session, although it's only 60 minutes. But I do have a playlist that you can watch on shadows. I have quite a lot of tips there. It's probably about an hour or so of watching over, I think, 8 videos or so. But well worth your time if you are trying to learn shadows, I think. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.